All right. So first of all, I would like to thank Emily, Susan, and Stephanie for organizing this conference and inviting me to participate, and to thank you in advance as well to Hannah and Renee for joining me in conversation. I'm going to be speaking about thank you. I'm going to be speaking about three of James Baldwin's texts today, and I'm going to use the presentation really so that you can see the text for yourself, the relevant portions that I'm discussing. All right. Okay. Two of the most significant turning points in the development of meta-narratives of the Holocaust are undoubtedly the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, and of course, the Historischer Streit elaborated in the German press in the mid-1980s. The Eichmann trial was designed by Israeli Attorney General Gideon Hausner and Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion to introduce the annihilation of the Jewish people as a discrete event, broadcasting a carefully selected set of 111 dramatic testimonies into the homes of millions of viewers around the world. The Historischer Streit, over 2 decades later, saw public and often caustic debates play out in Germany over the uniqueness of the genocide of the Jews and the uses and political implications of so-called historical relativization. Linking these turning points was the growing methodological and rhetorical insistence on the Holocaust's exceptional status. As Claudio Fogu, Todd Presner, and Wolf Kahnsteiner have argued in their introduction to the 2016 volume Probing the Ethics of Holocaust Culture, quote, reconfiguring the Nazi crimes as a Jewish event required isolating it from its World War II context, releasing it from the powerful grip of the previously dominant transnational master narratives of anti-totalitarianism and communism, and identifying it as a special type of occurrence. The moral injunctions of Holocaust memory, such as never forget and especially never again, contain a comparative impetus and seem to symbolize the interconnectedness between the memory of the Holocaust and that of other genocides. Yet, much of the theoretical and popular culture associated with Holocaust studies was developed by arguing for or assuming the Holocaust's exceptionality as a limit or test case, as a unique and absolute event, as the fundamental challenge to Western civilization, end quote. It took many decades and a number of important events for such a Holocaust exceptionalism to emerge. Yet, earlier post-war orientations toward fascism, championed in the Western liberal democracies victorious in the Second World War, reveal how exceptionalizing Nazi crimes as the fundamental challenge to Western civilization, ironically, perhaps counterintuitively, functioned to re-legitimize this Western civilization that had so spectacularly and cannibalistically imploded. Surveying the post-war scholarship on fascism and its definitional debates, Cedric Robinson identified the following constitutive meta-narrative. The Second World War represented a struggle in which liberal democracies rescued the West from the excesses of authoritarian leaders and mass movements, safeguarding individual freedom and reinscribing the political and moral authority of Western civilization. These accounts located the problem of fascism in its aberrant or deviant relation to the march of Western progress, a deviance that established the norm. Earlier and extant systems of racial violence and subjugation in Western liberal democracies and empires were accordingly presupposed as inconsequential to the West's moral and political legitimacy. However, from the perspective of many non-Western peoples, Robinson adds, quote, the occurrence of fascism was no more an historical aberration than colonialism, the slave trade, and slavery, end quote. Indeed, from a Black American minority point of view, poet Langston Hughes stated already in 1936 that fascism is a new name for that kind of terror the Black person has always faced in America. And James Baldwin, after the war, would affirm that the charming American dream of progress was, quote, a point of view which any sane or honest Negro will have some difficulty holding. Very few Americans have the courage to recognize that the America of which they dream and boast is not the America in which the Negro lives. It is a country which the Negro has never seen, end quote. Such perspectives challenge neither the extreme status nor novel ideological, technological, and industrial form of Nazi atrocities, as much as the way their characterization as an historical aberration functioned to affirm national civic ideals of redemption, individual agency, and procedural liberalism. It is not incidental that the post-war trials of Nazi perpetrators, debates about the nature of fascism, and the development of collective Holocaust memory were contemporaneous to anti-colonial and anti-racist uprisings around the world. These perspectives therefore outline a dynamic relationship between the developing memory of the Holocaust and the actuality of anti-racist militancy, calling attention to the role of national public recognition and memorialization in the reproduction of American society's status quo of inequality and violence. James Baldwin's engagement with the Holocaust in the 1960s specifically, the crucial decade in which the mainstream civil rights movement in the United States was eclipsed by radical Black anti-colonial and anti-war movements, reveals a struggle between white and Black American viewpoints over the Holocaust's exceptional status. There we go. Three of Baldwin's texts, published from 1962 to 1970, trace how he coded moral orientations toward the Holocaust to political orientations toward Black oppression and revolt. By toggling the development of Holocaust memory to the trajectory of Black militancy, Baldwin critiqued not only how Holocaust memory was enlisted to recuperate repressive national mythologies, he also disclosed how Holocaust memory provided a vital resource for interpreting the progression of anti-racist struggle from the mainstream civil rights movement to Black radicalism and finally to white backlash. In November 1962, the New Yorker magazine published Baldwin's unprecedented 20,000-word essay titled "Letter from a Region in My Mind." Baldwin had originally promised the essay on Black Muslims to the influential American Jewish liberal left commentary magazine. Given the increasing national notoriety of the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X in particular, Baldwin was to offer his own reflection and analysis of what appeared as a burgeoning radical alternative to the nonviolence and integrationism of the mainstream civil rights movement. The essay was composed and published following Baldwin's 2 trips to the US South, during which he observed and conversed with civil rights movement leaders, including the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and made contact with more radical student movements, including the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. The federal government was preaching incremental reform and recommending patience, while organized white people in Birmingham and Montgomery, Alabama, brutally bludgeoned anti-segregation activists. Baldwin, in the essay, documented the post-war Black loss of faith in white Christian power, including white liberal reformism, as an introduction to his treatment of the Nation of Islam. He recalled his own teenage realization that hard work and thrift would never provide salvation from poverty, scorn, and especially police violence. What Baldwin labeled the, quote, Puritan Yankee equation of virtue with well-being, end quote, in other words, the American dream's mythological promise of economic uplift in exchange for individual tenacity and self-improvement, appeared hopelessly fraudulent when viewed from the occupied territory that was Harlem. Similarly, other myths of the white majority, myths of Western civilized reason and Christian love, were found morally bankrupt from the standpoint of the Black American experience, in Baldwin's words. The experience of racial inequality and violence made evident the contradictions inherent to any white Christian or Western claim to moral superiority. And the moral ideologies preached by the powerful imprisoned the oppressed in part by disabling their militant revolt. He wrote, quote, "The Negro's experience of the white world cannot possibly create in him any respect for the standards by which the white world claims to live. His own condition is overwhelming proof that white people do not live by these standards. White people had no moral ground on which to stand. They had the judges, the juries, the shotguns, the law, in a word, power. And those virtues preached but not practiced by the white world were merely another means of holding Negroes in subjection," end quote. Here is where the Holocaust and fascism at large emerged as a crucial reference point. And it's a lengthy quote, so bear with me. "Not so very long ago, when the priests of that church which stands in Rome gave God's blessing to Italian boys being sent out to ravage a defenseless Black country, it was not possible to believe in a Black God. But time has passed, and in that time, the Christian world has revealed itself as morally bankrupt and politically unstable. The terms civilized and Christian begin to have a very strange ring when a Christian nation surrenders to a foul and violent orgy, as Germany did during the Third Reich. For the crime of their ancestry, millions of people in the middle of the 20th century and in the heart of Europe, God's citadel, were sent to a death so calculated, so hideous, and so prolonged that no age before this enlightened one had been able to imagine it, much less achieve and record it. From my own point of view, the fact of the Third Reich alone makes obsolete forever any question of Christian superiority except in technological terms. White people were and are astounded by the Holocaust in Germany. They did not know that they could act that way. But I very much doubt whether black people were astounded, at least in the same way. For my part, the fate of the Jews and the world's indifference to it frightened me very much. I could not but feel in those sorrowful years that this human indifference, concerning which I knew so much already, would be my portion on the day that the United States decided to murder its Negroes systematically instead of little by little and catch as catch can. I was, of course, authoritatively assured that what had happened to the Jews in Germany could not happen to the Negroes in America, but I thought bleakly that the German Jews had probably believed similar counselors, and again, I could not share the white man's vision of himself. Baldwin's extensive narration of white and black epistemological standpoints toward the Holocaust illustrated the gap between white liberal reformism and black militancy. He contrasted the Holocaust to the Italian fascist invasion of Ethiopia, which signified the white colonial violence blessed by the Catholic Church for some 400 years. The myth of white Christian power was, by the sheer force and magnitude of its violence, undeniable. But the European continent's descent into cannibalistic annihilation revealed so nakedly the political instability and moral bankruptcy of white Christian power, consequently recalibrating black faith in its authority. Also key to this recalibration, later described by Baldwin in the essay, was the curious experience of black American soldiers fighting in a segregated army against segregation abroad. Baldwin distinguished between the rupture the Holocaust represented for white Americans, who, quote, did not know that they could act that way, end quote, and the rupture it represented for black Americans like Baldwin, who interpreted the fate of the Jews as a specter of the United States' own genocidal potential. White bewilderment in the face of Nazi atrocities expressed a self-absolving claim to ignorance. The late, great Charles Mills described such viewpoints as white epistemologies of ignorance, structures of non-knowing, denial, and misrecognition, and he demonstrated how such epistemologies of ignorance play a role in the reproduction of domination and exploitation. White moral shock in the face of Nazi atrocities implied a non-knowing, a denial of historical and ongoing racial violence in the United States. Colonial genocide, cattle slavery, carceral repression, second-class citizenship, eugenic biopolitics, organized mob violence, state-sanctioned murder, and the list goes on. For black Americans, however, for whom denial of the resemblances was simply inconceivable, the Holocaust represented a rupture which was the basis for a forceful rejection of liberal reformism and patient nonviolence. This rupture considered Aryan German complacency as a precedent to white investments in liberal reformism, and Baldwin predicted that the growing black loss of faith in the myth of American progress would provoke a white backlash. Quote, "The power of the white world is threatened whenever a black man refuses to accept the white world's definitions. So every attempt is made to cut that black man down," end quote. The essay thus mapped two possible trajectories for Holocaust memory according to their political implications for anti-racism in the United States. Denial of the ongoing American horrors of racial governance and violence, which would then index an inability or unwillingness to transcend the racist status quo, or liberation from myths of white Christian superiority through commitment to the radical transformation of American society. In a later essay for the New York Times, Baldwin explicitly addressed Holocaust memory and the politics of comparison. Sent from Istanbul and published in April 1967, it was an expanded version of an open letter Baldwin had written to resign from the advisory board of the Black Nationalist Liberator magazine in response to a series of anti-Semitic articles the Liberator had published. In the open letter, Baldwin commented frankly, quote, "I think it is most distinctly unhelpful and I think it is immoral to blame Harlem on the Jew," end quote. Baldwin's full response to the Liberator series appeared in the New York Times with the rather polemical and somewhat misleading headline, quote, "Negroes are anti-Semitic because they are anti-white," end quote. In fact, Baldwin considered how social relations between Jewish landlords, pawnbrokers, shopkeepers, and philanthropists on the one hand, and impoverished Black Americans on the other, generated suspicion, envy, and blame. And he argued that Black anti-Semitism modeled a parody of white Christian racism. In the context of this rebuke, Baldwin also described how narratives of Jewish suffering and resistance were domesticated into a national mythology according to national racial scripts. He asserted, quote, "The Jew's suffering is recognized as part of the moral history of the world. The Jew is a white man, and when white men rise up against oppression, they are heroes. When Black men rise, they have reverted to their native savagery. The uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto was not described as a riot, nor were the participants maligned as hoodlums. The boys and girls in Watts and Harlem are thoroughly aware of this. But of course, my comparison of Watts and Harlem with the Warsaw Ghetto will be immediately dismissed as outrageous. There are many reasons for this, but the bottom reason is that it contradicts the American dream to suggest any gratuitous, unregenerate horror can happen here. We make our mistakes, we like to think, but we are getting better all the time," end quote. Baldwin argued that the juridical and social inclusion of most American Jews into racial whiteness in the United States overdetermined how Americans metabolized Jewish suffering and resistance in Eastern Europe, invalidating comparisons to those whom American racial mythologies had scripted as violent savages. Baldwin anticipated a peremptory dismissal. Quote, "My comparison of Watts and Harlem with the Warsaw Ghetto will be immediately dismissed as outrageous," end quote. For in addition to how the comparison transgressed the ideologies of anti-Blackness in the United States, it also called into question the American narrative of democratic progress. If the Watts Rebellion resembled the limit case of atrocity in Western civilization, then the belief that we are getting better all the time would be thoroughly discredited. The denial of comparison therefore fortified faith in American progress and could in turn legitimize the brutal counterinsurgency launched by the US state against the Watts uprising participants. The Los Angeles police chief had infamously characterized the uprising's participants as monkeys in a zoo, and in a comparison that had immediate material consequences, suggested the uprising be treated as a Viet Cong insurgency and met with an armed and militarized response. Something has changed since Baldwin's New Yorker essay. Baldwin no longer referred to the Holocaust as a specter haunting American society. He no longer spoke as a prophet, as he did in the New Yorker, promising, quote, "God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time," end quote. The Watts Rebellion in Los Angeles, incited by the combination of housing discrimination and police brutality, was proof that the fire of Black revolt had arrived, and the mobilization of thousands of law enforcement personnel to turn the neighborhood into a guerrilla war zone was a harbinger of technologies of subjugation to come. By the end of the decade, Baldwin's attention was fixed on the site of the prison. Nixon's Law and Order campaign had begun to construct the infrastructure of mass incarceration in the United States to quell Black unrest and repress Black radicalism, all with support, explicit and tacit, of the so-called silent white majority. Interestingly, Baldwin's turn to the prison was also catalyzed by his literal confrontation with a prison in Hamburg. In October 1967, Tony Maynard, Baldwin's former bodyguard, chauffeur, and friend, was falsely accused of murdering a white Marine, largely based purely on a description that the suspect was Black. At the time, Maynard was touring with jazz musicians in Germany and was held in the Hamburg prison while waiting for extradition to the United States. Baldwin took up work to support his release and defense, and his meditations on his visit to Maynard in the Hamburg prison first appeared in 1972 in No Name in the Street. This and others of Baldwin's writings from the early 1970s testify to a change in perspective away from the earlier concern with the function of Holocaust memory in American society and directly toward the correspondence between the US prison regime and the Nazi carceral system. But these concerns combined in a passionate open letter written to incarcerated radical Black intellectual Angela Davis and published in the New York Review of Books in 1970. Davis, a professor at UCLA, member of the Communist Party, and fellow traveler of the Black Panther Party, was arrested by FBI agents following a national manhunt and tendentiously charged with aggravated kidnapping and first-degree murder. After seeing the October 26, 1970 cover photograph of Newsweek magazine, which displayed Angela Davis in handcuffs, Baldwin felt compelled to write an open letter in her defense and campaign on her behalf in France, England, and Germany. The open letter began, quote, "One might have hoped that the very sight of chains on black flesh would be so intolerable a sight for the American people and so unbearable a memory that they would themselves spontaneously rise up and strike off the manacles. But no, they appear to glory in their chains. Now, more than ever, they appear to measure their safety in chains and corpses. And so Newsweek, civilized defender of the indefensible, attempts to drown you in a sea of crocodile tears and puts you on its cover chained." Baldwin posited that the photograph of Davis invoked a memory of the transatlantic slave trade and plantation slavery, illustrating the iterative quality of anti-black violence and repression across time. But he ultimately read the magazine cover as a sign of just the opposite, the white majority's denial of such a memory. With an unusual softness and sorrow, he continued, "You look exceedingly alone. As alone, say, as the Jewish housewife in the boxcar headed for Dachau, or as any one of our ancestors chained together in the name of Jesus, headed for a Christian land." Baldwin inserted the carceral oppression of Jewish women by Nazi Germany into the iterative loop. The ground of comparison was the Nazi technologies of incarceration and torture, drawing a continuity between them and the brutal political repression of radical black militants. The letter concluded with a sorrowful but determined warning. Quote, "Only a handful of the millions of people in this vast place are aware that the fate intended for you, Sister Angela, and for George Jackson, and for the numberless prisoners in our concentration camps, for that is what they are, is a fate which is about to engulf them too." The insistence, Baldwin's insistence, on representing US prisons as concentration camps reflected his recognition that interlocking practices of mass incarceration and state-sanctioned premature death, in Ruth Gilmore's terms, were now unfolding. In late 1969, indeed, the Chicago Police Department had assassinated chairman of the Illinois Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton, in a raid on his home organized by the FBI. And by the end of 1971, George Jackson, the prison intellectual and co-founder of the Black Guerrilla family, would be shot while trying to escape the brutal San Quentin prison. Baldwin's insistence on the metaphor refused to allow the white majority to deny the reality of brutal anti-black repression, therefore circumventing a disabling domestication of Holocaust memory into a white national mythology of ignorance. Baldwin's writing allows us to distinguish between two facets of a single problem: how the micromanagement of comparison constrains historical and political analysis on the one hand, and how, on the other, exceptionalizing rituals and meta-narratives of Holocaust memory can reconstitute mythologies of Western power and moral superiority. In Baldwin's final metaphor in the letter, he condensed political persecution, mass incarceration, and state-sanctioned murder into an ominous illustration that linked the violent repression of black radicalism to the chemical annihilation of the Jews. But it is also where comparison collapses metaphor and reality into one another, as lethal gas was indeed used as a method of execution at the San Quentin prison. And I will conclude with Baldwin's haunting words. "We know that we, the blacks, and not only we, the blacks, have been and are the victims of a system whose only fuel is greed, whose only God is profit. We know that the fruits of this system have been ignorance, despair, and death, and we know that the system is doomed because the world can no longer afford it. And we know that for the perpetuation of this system, we have all been mercilessly brutalized and have been told nothing but lies, lies about ourselves and our kinsmen and our past, and about love, life, and death, so that both soul and body have been bound in hell. If we know, then we must fight for your life as though it were our own, which it is, and render impassable with our bodies the corridor to the gas chamber. For if they take you in the morning, they will be coming for us that night. Therefore, peace." Thank you.